Okay, continuing here in week 2, chapter 2, talking about the origins of the Constitution. So if you go to slide number 6, obviously there's a little history here in it, but basically the colonies from 1620 to about the 1750s were pretty much left alone. Okay, 130 plus years. Again, the British government was 3,000 miles away, so they didn't really mess with them. Okay, what changed and what led the colonies toward the revolution was the fact that the Brits won the French and Indian War. Okay, and so that was the good news. The bad news is they went terribly in debt in order to win that war. And so they felt that, you know what, the least the colonists could do, because after all, we were defending them during this war, the least thing they can do is kind of, pony up and pay for this thing, okay? And so they basically started imposing all kinds of new taxes on the colonies, okay? The stamp tax, and there's a tea tax, and there's Townsend Acts. And again, you don't have to remember all of these. If this was an American history class, you would. But suffice to say, what you need to remember is they went from low or very minimal taxation to all of a sudden lots of taxation. And suddenly they're like, what? Why? What's the big, we didn't have a whole lot of beef in this war anyway, and that type of thing. And so you obviously had the Brit, there was pushback with the colonies. You had the Boston Tea Party of 1773. Then the Brits blockaded Boston Harbor. And so they created in 1774 the First Continental Congress, okay, to try to perhaps create a nation out of these separate individual colonies to deal with all of these issues, okay? And they started making formal demands on Great Britain. They started creating their own councils for the imposition of taxes. They basically pressed for the end of a British military occupation. They wanted guarantees of trial by local juries, okay? What was happening is as any of the colonists committed a crime, instead of standing trial in that colony or in that county where you committed the crime, they would put you on a ship and send you 3,000 miles to stand trial in England, okay? What are the chances of you being tried by a jury of your peers in England, okay? Not much. And so that was a big beef, okay? In other words, if you know anything about jury trials, it'll say you shall be tried by a jury made up of your peers. In other words, the people in your surrounding community, okay, who can identify with what's going on, and they kind of understand the, what's going on in that particular community, okay? They're not going to know that 3,000 miles away. So there was pushback about that type of thing, okay? And so the King George rejected their demands. And then suddenly now you had some skirmishes and some fighting occurring in 1775, in April 9th, Lexington and Concord, okay? 8 colonists died, and that's when the revolution began, okay? But again, realize there was such a history, again, 130 plus years of being largely left alone, that it was such a shock to them that's why they began to kind of bristle at this, because they were used to, again, self-government. Let me say it another way. Americans generally, okay, not always, but Americans generally have a problem with big government, okay? They don't want too much big government, okay? That's how the colonies looked at England, okay? England was big government. Okay, the king sending tax collectors and officers to suddenly levy all these new taxes to pay for the debts incurred because of the French and Indian War, that was big government, okay? In other words, the same bristling against big government that many Americans have today, we get it honestly, okay? We get it by our forebears, the colonies and the colonists. In other words, let me say another way. Whereas Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals tend to disagree on a lot of things, one of the things they generally are united about is they don't want tons of big government. In other words, if you ask the average American, what do you think about what's going on in Washington? Okay, the average American's like, I don't like it. I'm not thrilled about it. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, there's lots of cries for reform in our nation. okay? And a lot of that is a remnant of how the Brits bristled at big government, right? Coming over from London and imposing all these new taxes, okay? So if you go to the next slide there, that would be slide number 7, talking about the Declaration of Independence. Okay, there was all kinds of ideas on how to create and form a new government, and that was used to develop the Declaration of Independence. There was something called social contract theory developed from Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, and that was utilized by Thomas Jefferson and John Adams when they created the Declaration of Independence. And the idea of social contract theory is simply this, is that when a government is created, the idea that prior to government, you exist in a state of nature. What's a state of nature? In a state of nature, you get to do whatever you want. That's the good news. The bad news is, in a state of nature, everyone else gets to do everything they want. So your life, your property, your wife, right? Everything is fragile, okay? The strong take advantage of the weak. And so basically there's all kinds of killing going on, it's kind of anarchy, it's chaos. It's a complete absence of government. And so the idea of the creation of government leads to a social contract, okay? This idea that, listen, in a state of government, I can be the judge, jury, executioner, I can form a posse, things like that. I can kind of take the law into my own hands. When you leave that, because you realize that life is, as Thomas Hobbes says in A State of Nature, life is nasty, brutish, and short, okay, and you move over to under government, you give up the right to vigilante justice. You give up the right to be your own jury. You give up the right to be your own executioner, okay? You delegate that to the police. You delegate that to government. And you agree to relinquish some of those things to come under government and its order, okay, in a state of nature. That's what the Declaration of Independence is. That's what the Declaration of Independence recognizes, the importance of a social contract or a social compact, okay? So you can see there in slide number 7 at the bottom, John Locke asserted that people living in a state of nature enjoy certain inalienable rights. There are natural pre-political rights that you have given by God. Your right to life, your right to liberty, your right to property, your right to petition government. In other words, these are rights that you have even before there's government, okay? You've got them. When you leave the state of nature and you come under the order of government, you don't lose any of those inalienable rights, okay? You do relinquish the right for vigilante justice. You do relinquish the right to take the law into your own hands. But you keep a number of inalienable pre-political rights. Government didn't give it to you. Government can't take it away. Okay, that idea there, okay? So the right to life, liberty, property, these are threatened by those who steal, kill, and otherwise act without regard to others, okay? So the Declaration of Independence recognizes that, okay? So when we're talking about the Declaration of Independence, where did Jefferson get a lot of his ideas? Okay, we already talked about Hobbes and Locke in the sense of a social contract, okay? But one of the overarching themes that you see throughout the Declaration of Independence is the consistency of this idea of natural law. There's a natural law that stands above government, that stands above politicians, that stands above kings, that stands above any kind of ruler, and a just government and a just politician, right? And a just state is a state that stays aligned with the laws of, well, what Jefferson said, the laws of nature and nature's God, okay? And so Jefferson was asked late in his life, okay? In again, if you go to slide number 8, you'll see Jefferson's letter to Henry Lee. Henry Lee wrote him a letter, okay? And basically he asked him, where did you get all these ideas from? Where did you get the ideas of the Declaration of Independence? Where did they come from? And so he wrote this letter in 1825. He died in 1826. Okay, so a year before he died, he wrote this letter, and this is what he said. This was the object of the Declaration of Independence. not to find out any new principles or new arguments never before thought of, not merely to say things which had never been said before, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent and justify ourselves in the independent stand we are compelled to take. All its authority rests on the harmonizing sentiments of the day, whether expressed in conversation, in letters, printed essays, or in the elementary books of public right, as Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, Sidney, etc. Okay, so what he says was, if you want to understand what I wrote about, look at basically the harmonizing sentiments of the day. We were all thinking this. It's not like we made this up. And also look in printed essays, and also look at the writings of Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, and Sidney. Okay, so we're going to take a look at these. Again, I've got these included within Canvas and the extra readings. But what Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher, and Cicero, the great Roman statesman, who wrote before the collapse of the Roman Republic, who John Locke, who was a Christian author, and Algernon Sidney, who wrote, another author of a Christian author. Okay, you got four authors. Okay, two writing before the pre-Christian era. One was a Greek, one was a Roman, and then later on, Sidney wrote in the 1600s, and so did Locke. And so they were separated by about almost 2,000 years. Okay, give or take. They all agree on the same thing. There's a natural law. There's a law of nature, and nature's God. And a good and just system of government must adhere to that. If it falls outside of that, it becomes an illegitimate form of government, and it leads to a form of tyranny. Okay? All four of them agree on that concept, which is actually remarkable because they're separated by time, they're separated by language, they're separated by religious convictions or none, okay? And they all agree on the same thing. And that is the foundation upon which Jefferson rested the Declaration of Independence. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to talk about each of the arguments of all four of them in turn in the next lecture.